So we understand the balance sheet, we understand the cap table. What comes next? Well, what I want to do now is tear apart this notion of shares. And that's going to be the next piece of this episode. So let's do that. So we're going to drop our cap table for a moment. So when we're talking about shares, when we're talking about ownership interests, when we're talking about these things that we use to measure or calculate ownership percentages in our company for purposes of knowing how we chop up net proceeds, there are two primary classes of shares. So now we're taking the large category of ownership interests, the large category of shares, and now we're going to break it down. There are common shares, and there are preferred shares. Common shares are the default form of share. So if there are no other shares, all the shares are common, even if they're not called common. It's the residual, basic, default way of referring to ownership interests in the company. 99.99% of the time, common shares are issued, they are awarded to people, to parties, to groups, to entities who are acquiring their ownership interests in the startup for services. Employees, contractors, consultants, advisors, directors, founders. Founders get common shares. If you're getting your equity, if you're getting your ownership, if you're getting your shares for services, chances are you're getting common shares. So now, what are preferred shares? This becomes obvious real quick. If you're getting your shares for money, chances are you're going to be buying preferred shares. Now, are there times that a startup sells common shares for cash? It happens, but not often and increasingly rarely. Are there times where a startup will award or issue preferred shares in exchange for services? Sometimes, but rarely. The basic rule is this. If you're rendering services, common shares. If you're showing up with money, you get preferred shares. So then the question becomes, why the difference? Why does an investor in particular say, I would prefer, see what I did there? Preferred shares over common shares. Why? What's better about preferred shares? What's the advantage? Well, let's talk about that. Preferred shares at 30,000 feet have advantages that can drop into one of two categories. One is control or governance. The second is economics. And we will take them in order. First, we'll talk about control and governance. Next, we'll talk about economics.